There comes a moment when the sweetest heart snaps, not loudly, not violently, just silently and permanently. And the person who once healed everyone suddenly stops healing anyone. Before I go on, if you've ever felt yourself closing off after being hurt too many times, hit the follow, share this message, and stay with me because what comes next might explain the part of you you've never understood. Repeated emotional wounds can completely reshape a person's inner world, especially for someone whose natural instinct is to feel deeply and care without limits. When an empath faces continuous hurt, whether through betrayal, manipulation, or abandonment, their once open heart begins to recognize danger before it even manifests. At first, the empath might rationalize the pain, convince themselves it was a misunderstanding, or assume that people will eventually change. They keep giving, keep trusting, because their very identity is tied to understanding and supporting others. But with each wound, each instance of being taken for granted or hurt, the emotional ledger starts tipping. The heart that once instinctively reached out begins to hesitate. Initially, the hesitations are small. Maybe they pause before offering advice, or they filter what they share, testing if the other person will respond with the same care and consideration they always give. This hesitation is not a weakness, it is the mind's survival mechanism kicking in. Each emotional wound leaves a scar, a subtle imprint that signals danger. Over time, these scars accumulate, creating a network of defenses designed to prevent further harm. The empath learns, sometimes unconsciously, that limitless giving carries a cost, and the repeated cost begins to outweigh the reward. The repeated pain does something else. It reshapes expectations. Where there was once unconditional belief in the good of people, there is now cautious calculation. Trust becomes earned rather than assumed. The empathetic nature that allowed them to absorb the emotions of others is recalibrated to protect themselves first. And this recalibration, while necessary, can feel like a betrayal to their own identity. They wonder how they became someone so wary, so measured, when their essence was once pure openness. But this transformation is not about abandoning empathy, it is about survival. It is the natural response to an environment that consistently exploits vulnerability. As these emotional wounds pile up, the empath's heart grows quieter. They no longer announce their feelings or share their inner world freely. Walls rise, not in arrogance, but in self-preservation. What once flowed outward now retreats inward, forming a protective shell that is often misunderstood by outsiders as coldness or detachment. This shift is critical. Without it, the empath would continue absorbing pain, eventually breaking under the weight of cumulative hurt. The repeated emotional wounds then act as both teacher and catalyst, forcing a person to evolve from an open-hearted giver into someone who prioritizes their own emotional safety, ensuring they can survive in a world that has repeatedly shown them that unguarded vulnerability comes at a high cost. In essence, repeated emotional wounds transform the empath's innate compassion into cautious strength, reshaping who they are at the core, not out of choice, but out of necessity. An empath's compassion, by its very nature, is boundless. They instinctively feel the emotions of others, often placing the needs of those around them above their own. This deep, unwavering empathy is a gift, allowing them to connect, understand, and heal in ways that others simply cannot. However, when this compassion is repeatedly exploited, it can become a liability. Each time the empath gives without reciprocity, each time they sacrifice their own peace for someone else's gain, a subtle erosion begins. What was once a strength slowly becomes a point of vulnerability. They start to feel drained, unseen and unappreciated. The world, instead of nurturing their kindness, takes it for granted. Over time, empaths who are constantly hurt begin to question the value of their compassion. They notice patterns. People who are supposed to care for them hurt them instead, and those they trust often use their openness against them. The very trait that makes them remarkable, the ability to feel deeply and respond sincerely, becomes a target. Compassion, when unchecked and unprotected, leaves them exposed to manipulation, deceit, and emotional exhaustion. The empath begins to see that being kind and understanding does not guarantee safety or respect. In fact, sometimes it seems that the more they give, the more others take. This repeated exploitation triggers an internal shift. The empath begins to develop boundaries, not because they no longer care, but because their survival depends on it. Their compassion is no longer blind. It becomes selective, cautious, and self-preserving. They start to gauge who truly deserves their energy, learning to discern between genuine need and opportunistic demand. This is a turning point. The empath is no longer freely giving to anyone who asks. Instead, they give with intention, conserving their emotional energy for situations and people that are worthy of it. The danger, however, is in perception. To outsiders, the empath's new cautiousness may look like indifference or emotional withdrawal. They may be labeled as cold, calculating, or even narcissistic. But this is a misreading of the situation. What has changed is not the empath's capacity to care. It is the way they protect themselves while continuing to care. Compassion remains, but it is no longer a weapon used against them. It becomes a conscious choice, a shield against repeated hurt, and a declaration that their empathy has limits, and those limits must be respected. In essence, an empath's compassion becomes both their greatest asset and their most vulnerable point. Repeated exploitation forces them to transform it into a protective force, ensuring they can survive, maintain dignity, and continue to offer care without being destroyed in the process. Overexposure to manipulation has a way of changing even the most open-hearted person. For an empath who naturally feels and absorbs the emotions of others, constant exposure to deceit, gaslighting, and emotional games slowly rewires the way they interact with the world. Each encounter with manipulation is like a drop of water slowly wearing away stone. At first, the empath might not even notice. They are so used to giving, so used to seeing the good in others, that they unconsciously excuse the behavior, rationalize the lies, or take the blame upon themselves. But repeated exposure leaves marks that run deep, shaping perceptions, reactions, and ultimately boundaries. What begins as confusion eventually becomes vigilance. The empath starts to sense motives and detect patterns that others overlook. They notice when people's words don't match their actions, when charm masks control, and when kindness is conditional. This awareness, however, comes at a cost. Every manipulation they endure erodes trust, chips away at innocence, and breeds a quiet wariness. The empath learns that not everyone deserves access to their heart, and that showing vulnerability can sometimes be dangerous. Emotional openness, which once flowed freely, becomes measured. They are no longer immediately available for the pain of others. Instead, they evaluate whether engaging will deplete them further. Overexposure also triggers an internal recalibration. The empath begins constructing boundaries like walls around their heart. These walls are not built out of malice. They are defensive structures meant to prevent further harm. What once was unconditional giving becomes selective, a deliberate choice rather than an automatic reflex. Silence replaces oversharing. Thoughtfulness replaces impulsive generosity. Emotional energy, once scattered widely, is now conserved, carefully distributed only to those who have earned trust. In essence, the empath transforms from a sponge absorbing everything to a guardian of their own emotional territory. The transformation can be jarring, both for the empath and for those who knew them before. Outsiders may perceive them as cold, detached, or even self-centered, but the truth is that overexposure to manipulation forces a person to evolve in order to survive. The traits that are labeled as narcissistic, caution, discernment, self-prioritization, are in fact protective mechanisms. They are the result of repeated lessons learned through pain and the necessity of defending one's emotional well-being. Ultimately, overexposure to manipulation teaches the empath that their heart, while generous, is not inexhaustible. To continue surviving and thriving, they must transform their natural openness into a shield, an armor forged not out of cruelty, but out of resilience, wisdom, and the hard-earned understanding that self-preservation is the first step toward authentic compassion. The shift from an open-hearted empath to someone who seems unrecognizable does not happen because of a desire to dominate or control. It happens because of survival. When an empath is repeatedly hurt, taken for granted, or manipulated, they start to realize that the world will not treat them the way they treat others. The qualities that once defined them, their openness, vulnerability, and readiness to forgive, are no longer safe to display without consequence. Slowly, the traits that made them so giving begin to transform, not into cruelty, but into protection. The empath begins to adopt behaviors that feel foreign to their original self. Self-prioritization, cautious engagement, and sometimes a calculated detachment. This transformation is subtle at first. A smile that once greeted everyone now appears selectively. A shoulder that was always ready to bear another's burdens is extended only to those who have proven trustworthy. The empath's intuition becomes sharper, more discerning, and less forgiving. Each painful experience teaches them lessons that cannot be ignored, that not everyone is deserving of their energy, that their kindness can be exploited, and that emotional openness can sometimes be weaponized against them. These lessons, though harsh, are essential for survival. The outward signs of this transformation may appear narcissistic to those who only see behavior, not history. Boundaries are strengthened, emotional reactions are measured, and personal needs are prioritized. The empath may no longer allow themselves to be drawn into every conflict or absorb every emotion around them. To some, this seems like coldness. To the empath, it is preservation. It is the practical adaptation of a heart that has learned through repeated pain that unchecked vulnerability comes at a cost too high to pay repeatedly. Internally, the shift feels like a recalibration of the self. The empath is not losing their capacity to feel. They are choosing to feel selectively, reserving the deepest levels of care for situations and people that truly warrant it. This is the turning point where survival instincts override old patterns of self-sacrifice. The traits that once left them exposed to harm are reconfigured into tools for protection. Empathy is no longer boundless. It is tempered with discernment, courage, and self-respect. Ultimately, this transformation is not about becoming someone cruel or manipulative. It is about reclaiming the self that was repeatedly wounded. It is a necessary evolution, a way for the empath to continue existing in a world that often misunderstands generosity as weakness. Through this shift, they become not less human, but more human, stronger, wiser, and equipped to protect the most valuable resource they possess, their own heart. Silence, distance, and detachment become the empath's tools long before they even realize it. After being hurt repeatedly, the empath learns that speaking too much, sharing too much, or giving too much often invites more pain than relief. Their words, once warm and flowing, are measured now, chosen carefully to protect rather than to placate. They begin to recognize that emotional energy is finite and that overextending it to accommodate others' needs can leave them hollow and vulnerable. What appears to outsiders as coldness or withdrawal is, in reality, a conscious act of self-preservation, a way to safeguard the heart that has been battered too many times. The empath starts to retreat before damage occurs, not after. They no longer assume that people will act with integrity or kindness. Instead, they anticipate potential harm and adjust their behavior accordingly. Emotional detachment is not a lack of feeling, it is a strategic choice. By creating distance, they reduce the opportunities for manipulation, betrayal, and disappointment. Over time, this distance becomes habitual, shaping how they interact with the world and how the world perceives them. To someone who doesn't understand the history behind it, this behavior can seem aloof or even narcissistic, but it is fundamentally different. It is born of survival, not self-aggrandizement. Silence becomes a shield as well as a signal. The empath no longer feels the need to explain, justify, or defend their actions. Words that once flowed freely to maintain harmony or comfort others are now conserved for moments that truly matter. This silence carries power. It communicates boundaries without confrontation, strength without aggression. In choosing what to share and when, the empath exercises control over their own energy and over the way others can influence their emotions. Detachment, in turn, allows the empath to reclaim a sense of self that was previously diluted by constant care for others. Where they once absorbed the pain, anxiety, and expectations of everyone around them, they now prioritize their own emotional landscape. This doesn't mean they stop caring entirely. It means they care with intention, choosing where to invest their empathy and whom to trust with their vulnerability. In essence, silence, distance, and detachment are not signs of a heart gone cold. They are the evolution of a heart that has learned the hard way that protection comes before generosity. They are the tools that allow an empath to survive in a world that repeatedly mistakes kindness for weakness, transforming a once overexposed heart into one that is resilient, self-aware, and unyielding when necessary. These adaptations are the empath's quiet revolution, their declaration that being hurt too many times will no longer dictate their worth or their boundaries. The empath's learning curve is steep when it comes to emotional logic. After being repeatedly hurt, they realize that pure feelings alone cannot safeguard them from pain. Empathy, while beautiful, is not enough to navigate a world filled with manipulation, deceit, and selfishness. Over time, the empath begins to pair their natural sensitivity with reasoning, observation, and careful judgment. They start to weigh situations not just on how they feel, but on patterns of behavior, consistency of words and actions, and the likelihood of reciprocity. Emotional labor, once given freely without thought, becomes a calculated investment. They learn that their heart is valuable and must be protected. This shift toward emotional logic is not about becoming cold or unfeeling. It is about survival and self-respect. The empath begins to recognize red flags and patterns that they previously ignored in the name of kindness. They start asking questions. Who benefits from my care? Who respects my boundaries? Who will reciprocate my efforts with honesty and integrity? These questions, once foreign to their natural instincts, become tools for preserving their emotional well-being. They begin to distinguish between genuine need and opportunistic exploitation, learning to respond with wisdom rather than reflexive generosity. As a result, the empath's interactions change. Where they once dove headfirst into the emotions of others, they now approach situations with discernment. Compassion is no longer unconditional, it is strategic. They offer support where it is meaningful and safe, and they step back where it is draining or dangerous. This emotional logic acts as both a shield and a compass, guiding them through relationships and circumstances that could previously have caused repeated pain. It transforms vulnerability into intentionality. The transformation also extends inward. The empath starts to monitor their own emotional health, setting limits on how much they absorb from others. They recognize that constant giving without discernment erodes self-worth, and they take responsibility for maintaining their emotional integrity. This balance between feeling deeply and thinking clearly allows them to reclaim control over their heart, which was once a playground for others' manipulation. Ultimately, the empath's turn to emotional logic is not a betrayal of their nature, it is the evolution of it. They become capable of caring without being consumed, of loving without being exploited, and of navigating life with both heart and mind. Through repeated hurt, they learn that emotional intelligence is not just about feeling. It is about knowing when, where, and how to invest that feeling in a world that has shown them that unguarded empathy can come at too high a cost. The empath's transformation is often triggered by survival instincts rather than any conscious desire to change. After enduring repeated pain, betrayal, or emotional exploitation, they reach a point where instinct overtakes habit. The once boundless capacity to give and forgive becomes recalibrated into self-preservation. This is not a matter of ego or desire for control. It is a fundamental shift in priority. The empath begins to see their own well-being as a non-negotiable necessity, recognizing that if they continue to give without boundaries, they risk losing the very essence of themselves. Survival instincts manifest in several ways. The empath becomes more guarded, selective, and deliberate in their interactions. Where they once trusted implicitly, they now verify, observe, and assess. They learn to recognize patterns of behavior that signal potential harm and adjust accordingly. Emotional energy, once dispersed freely, is now carefully allocated, reserved for situations and people that demonstrate respect, reciprocity, and integrity. This instinctive recalibration is a protective mechanism, ensuring that their heart remains intact even in the face of repeated adversity. The shift is also internal. The empath begins to prioritize their needs, desires, and emotional health without guilt. What once might have been seen as selfishness is, in fact, a critical strategy for survival. They understand that overextending themselves leaves them vulnerable to exploitation, emotional exhaustion, and continued heartbreak. By placing their own well-being first, they establish boundaries that were previously absent or easily breached. These boundaries are not arbitrary. They are carefully constructed based on experience, intuition, and hard-earned lessons about human behavior. Outwardly, this transformation can appear startling. The empath may seem detached, assertive, or even self-centered. But these behaviors are not signs of inherent cruelty or narcissism. They are evidence of survival. Every guarded smile, measured response, and selective engagement reflects an evolved understanding of how to navigate a world that has repeatedly caused pain. The empath learns to protect their inner world while still remaining capable of connection, but only with those who demonstrate respect and reciprocity. Ultimately, this survival-driven transformation is a testament to resilience. The empath does not abandon their nature, they refine it. By turning inward, setting boundaries, and prioritizing self-preservation, they ensure that their capacity for empathy remains intact, sustainable, and powerful. It is a recalibration born of necessity, a way to survive, thrive, and reclaim agency over a heart that has been tested too many times to continue giving without discernment. The transformation of an empath after repeated emotional trauma is not about losing their humanity. It is about reclaiming it. When kindness and vulnerability have been exploited over and over, the empath learns that unchecked openness leaves them exposed to harm. They realize that survival requires more than compassion. It requires discernment, boundaries, and the courage to protect their own emotional integrity. This evolution is triggered not by malice, but by necessity. The empath begins to prioritize self-preservation over unconditional giving, understanding that their heart is their most valuable asset. As this shift occurs, empathy becomes intentional rather than automatic. The empath no longer absorbs every emotional wave around them or sacrifices themselves at the expense of their well-being. They learn to recognize which situations are safe to invest in and which are likely to drain or exploit them. Each interaction is filtered through experience, intuition, and a refined sense of judgment. This conscious approach allows them to care deeply while avoiding the repeated harm that once left them vulnerable. In this way, their natural compassion is preserved and strengthened rather than wasted. The transformation also affects how the empath perceives others. People who were once given unconditional trust are now met with caution, and interactions are approached with awareness. Silence, selective sharing, and measured responses replace impulsive openness. These behaviors may be misinterpreted by outsiders as coldness or self-centeredness, but they are in fact survival tools. They ensure that the empath remains in control of their own emotional space, protecting their energy from being hijacked by manipulation, deceit, or repeated betrayal. Internally, the empath becomes more self-reliant. Emotional resilience grows as they learn to rely on their own judgment, intuition, and strength. They stop seeking validation or approval from those who have proven unreliable, and they cultivate a sense of autonomy that was once absent. By doing so, they reclaim the authority over their own emotions that was repeatedly undermined by others. This shift empowers them to engage with the world on their own terms, choosing when and how to invest their care without fear of exploitation. Ultimately, the empath's transformation is an evolution, not a corruption. The traits labeled as narcissistic, detachment, selective engagement, self-prioritization are actually defenses forged through repeated pain. They are tools that allow the empath to survive, thrive, and continue giving in a sustainable way. The empath emerges not hardened, but wise, not cold, but discerning, not diminished, but fully awake to the value of their own heart. This is the true power of emotional survival, a heart that has been tested, protected, and reborn, capable of giving without losing itself again. In the end, the journey of an empath who has been hurt too many times is not a story of loss or corruption. It is a story of survival, growth, and reclaiming power. Every boundary they set, every pause they take, and every measure of self-protection is a testament to their resilience. They do not abandon their compassion. They refine it, learning to give wisely rather than recklessly. What may appear to the outside world as detachment, coldness, or even selfishness is, in truth, a declaration. Their heart is valuable, and it will no longer be treated as expendable. This transformation is a reminder that empathy and strength are not mutually exclusive. An empath can care deeply while remaining fiercely protective of their own well being. They can love without losing themselves, and they can offer kindness without being consumed by it. The journey from vulnerability to self preservation is not about becoming someone unrecognizable. It is about becoming whole again, fully aware of their worth and unwilling to settle for anything less than respect, reciprocity, and emotional safety. Ultimately, the empath who has endured and survived emerges stronger, wiser, and unshakable. They carry the depth of their feelings as a source of power rather than a point of exploitation. Their transformation is not a betrayal of who they once were, but a reclamation of their true self, a heart that has been tested, tempered, and reborn, capable of giving and thriving without losing itself in the process. This is the triumph of emotional resilience, a soul that has learned to protect itself while still embracing the beauty of empathy.